welcome to the Vandal Factory podcast. My name's Natalie Quatermass.
I'm Henry Raby.
And together we are
Vandal Factory.
And this is the Vandal Factory Factory Floor Cut.
So normally on the Vandal Factory podcast, you'll hear interviews with amazing activists and artists, and we don't have enough time to put the whole interviews up there.
But we have such awesome chats, we thought it's about time that we started sharing the whole interviews with you.
So we did a special episode on disability, arts and activism back in December 2023. So you're going to hear the full conversation we had with Gill Crawshaw.
Gill was such a wonderful person to speak to. I could have actually just talked to her all day, and I hope we cross paths again. She's Leeds-based, isn't she?
She's Leeds-based.
We'll see her again because I think actually at one point we'd stopped recording and then we just continued chatting, and I was like, press play, Henry, press play. This is so good. She was awesome and had such an amazing energy, and I'm sure that comes across in her interview as well. Let us know what you think, if you enjoy it, and check out Gill's work.
Yeah, and check out the full episode if you're interested, the full 90-minute special on disability, arts and activism and other Vandal Factory episodes.
Here it is.
So we're here, back in the studio at Chapel FM Arts Centre. We've had a really good day out to Manchester, over the Pennines, to the People's History Museum in Manchester. But now we're back on Yorkshire soil to chat to Gill Crawshaw. So Gill is an activist and curator of disability arts. Her exhibitions she's curated: Possible All Along, Piss on Pity, Shoddy, The Reality of Small Differences, and the current exhibition, Any Work That Wanted Doing. She has a book coming out, an essay, a booklet, a little mini book called Rights Not Charity, Protest, Textiles and Disability Activism, and also led a workshop at the Manchester People's History Museum on the fabric of protest. Welcome, Gill.
Wow, welcome, Gill, who I'm already, in this short amount of time that I've spoken to you, getting that you're someone who hides your light under a bushel. You need to be proud of this amazing work. Please tell us, where did your interest in activism, disability, textiles, where did that all begin?
I'll try not to go into such a long story. I came to Leeds years ago to university to do textile design. So that was one start. At that point, it was while I was at university, I became disabled. Later on, I got involved in the disabled people's movement, and I was a local contact for DAN, the Disabled People's Direct Action Network, throughout much of the 90s. So DAN was a group that used to typically block traffic, handcuff ourselves to buses and trains. We had a real focus on accessible public transport, pre the Disability Discrimination Act, pre the Equality Act. So I've been involved in activism, including disabled people's activism in the past. And in more recent years, I got into curating, I suppose. I haven't, in the meantime, I haven't had a career in the arts, but I got involved in curating an exhibition, which itself was a form of protest. Mm. And that was the one that you mentioned, The Reality of Small Differences, and that was protesting about Grace and Perry, exhibition of work by Grace and Perry being put in a venue in Leeds that wasn't accessible to everybody. So rather than doing a picket I had the idea of let's do a counter exhibition to that. And that work in that exhibition was textile work by disabled artists from Yorkshire. So this was starting to bring textiles and activism together, I suppose. That was a few years ago. And then, yes, that went down so well, it became an event in its own right, as well as being an effective protest as it happened. It certainly got the issue raised. It was in the media. Also, the museum in question installed a stair climber because there was a small flight of stairs up to one of the rooms where some of Grace and Perry's work was being shown. As I say, it was a really great exhibition actually, and put me in touch with lots of artists around the region that I didn't know, and a lot of those artists and people who come in to see the exhibition said, when are you going to do another one? This was great. If there were artists, we don't get enough opportunities to do this. We want more opportunities to show our work. And that resulted in Shoddy a bit later. And then after that, there's been others. I won't go through them all. And yeah. They haven't all used textiles, but, you know, it seemed... Well, when I organised Shoddy, that's when I started thinking about issues around textiles and disabled people particularly. I was just thinking around the topic, really, and it turned out there was quite a lot to think about. There were all sorts of things, all sorts of connections, and you know that comes up in the book, Rights Not Charity, that you mentioned, that's going to be published by Common Threads Press later this month, and it comes up in terms of thinking about the textile industry, but of course it comes up in terms of contemporary art as well. A lot of contemporary artists using textiles, and most of my projects have been about working with disabled artists and about raising issues to do with disabled people's lives. So generally, you know, if I want to call myself a curator, I'd say I'm a curator who's informed by experience of activism, and with this interest in textiles sometimes. I've got an agenda when I'm curating. I'm not, I'm not just curating for the sake of it. I do have an agenda, and that is to raise issues and get people thinking and talking about disabled people's lives a bit more.
Fantastic.
So, yeah.
I'm very, very excited to read this booklet, Common Threads. So you've sort of started to introduce us a little bit as to how that seemed to have come about. Seemed. Ho-ho. Can you tell us a little bit more about what, if anyone's going to go and explore that and read it? Do you say it's not yet been published soon? So if they Google Gill Crawshaw Common Threads shortly, this will be able
well, it
to
might come up now, because I know they've been really good at putting the word out about it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's very clearly about politics and activism, because it's about banners of the disabled people's movement. So, as I say, thinking around issues to do with textiles, and obviously all sorts of social movements and social justice movements use banners, but that includes the disabled people's movement, and we've had some good ones. And I'm not going to say all, because you won't want to read the book if I tell you everything that's in it. But I was just thinking about, that there have been some really good ones. It's interesting because, using textiles can be something that's quite accessible for disabled people, accessible for a lot of people for sure, but accessible for disabled people. And thinking about, just disabled people and protest, and how that oftentimes, anyway, people don't expect disabled people to be out on the streets and to be protesting. So, we're sort of challenging a few stereotypes and, making people think twice about what disabled people want, what disabled people are capable of.
As we mentioned, Henry and I have just come back from Manchester's People's... Why do I always get that wrong? Manchester's People's Working History, the People History Museum. And we're thinking in front of these glorious banners that have been made and curated in that exhibition there, and we were talking about how sounds obvious, but the textiles are tactile and visual and colourful and bold, and you can use words, but there's also an awful lot of imagery that seems like it's another way of staking a claim for a disabled person who's often made invisible or is not, that their needs are not being thought of and they're being excluded. It's a way of becoming extra visible really when you're doing a protest. Yeah. And that connection, I don't think had been like quite as visceral for me before until I'd been to that exhibition today.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely right. And they're a way and not just banners, but other textiles are a way to express strong feelings, you know, and to express anger. They can be used that way, you know, the humble textile. So, yeah, you're absolutely right.
And there's also this quilting in particular has got such a rich history. But we were talking briefly before. I only know a tiny bit about this, but sort of a history in South America with enslaved people using quilting as a coding and ways of symbolizing and sending messages. I might be going off-piste here. That might be something slightly different. But there's certainly an idea of groups of people who are oppressed sitting around and making something together and doing something with your hands, and that enabling stories to occur. In the same way you'd sit around a fire, I think, and start telling stories.
And I think it's using material. That's the about using materials that are to hand as well, that you can get hold of. Yeah. Which, you know, and making something out of almost nothing sometimes with scraps and reusing things and the offcuts.
Which of course then ties into the environmental movement and reusing and has overlaps with that whole protest movement as well.
Yeah. And also, in terms of disabled people, you know, then textiles has been used in institutions for disabled people to keep people quiet, to keep people busy. So, you know, in the past, whether that's been in asylums and workhouses, and, you know, needlework to keep particularly women there quiet, something to get on with, something to do. Also, sometimes those institutions would sell that work, so make money out of it as well. But there's, you know, a long history as well of needlework, of sewing, knitting, etc., being used, as I say, in institutions for disabled people. I'm quite interested in that for a number of almost, you know, reasons that are pulling against each other a bit, because, you know, the exhibitions that I've curated are art exhibitions, working with disabled artists. And very often I think people's view of what disabled artists might be producing has been influenced a bit by what they know about the sort of work that's produced in institutions, in day centres, that's maybe produced, you know, as occupational therapy, which is all well and good, you know, and I'm not saying that there's not value in that, but then people have this other idea, disabled people in textile art, it must be this. It must be the sorts of things that people produce in day centres. So, you know, that, people, when they've been to a number of exhibitions I've organised, have been like, oh my goodness, I wasn't expecting this. This is amazing. I had this idea in my head it would be this, and it isn't. Oh yes, of course, these are artists, you know. Yeah. So there's that, you know, that is interesting, let's say. But also, on the other hand, a lot of that work that was produced in institutions was incredibly skillful. And, you know, so, yes, the institutions were able to make money out of it. So that's quite interesting. So I'd like to delve into that side of it a bit more. But, of course, none of this stuff, you know, it probably doesn't exist anymore. That's the thing about textiles, you know, they're easy and portable to carry about, but they don't necessarily last very long, or people don't necessarily value them, just see it as a piece of whatever, you know. But I'd quite like to look into that idea and try and dig out some of that, or some sort of images or some sort of evidence of, the really skillful work that disabled people have made.
Well, you've very kindly brought along with us a booklet, a zine. Would you call this a zine? I think it's a very beautiful zine that's called A Handsome Testimonial, The Life and Times of James Scott, 1829 to 1912, a deaf man who lived and worked in Horbury, Yorkshire, being one of many disabled people who contributed to the textile industry of this region. I cannot wait to get stuck into this. Can you give us a little overview? Who was James Scott?
Well, I won't give you an overview of James Scott, actually, particularly. I might mention James Scott, but this is some ongoing research I've been doing as well. I said there's there's quite a lot to talk about in disabled people and textiles. So I've been researching disabled people who work in textile mills from the Industrial Revolution onwards, really. A lot of it has focused on the Industrial Revolution. And I'm wanting to show mainly that disabled people are everywhere. Disabled people have been active contributors and are active contributors to the world in lots of different ways. Here's one example of where disabled people have been at the thick of things, haven't been bystanders, and that's in the textile industry, which obviously was the driving force of the Industrial Revolution in this country and was phenomenally important in this region and in this city, Leeds. Where we are. Yeah. So, yeah, I've been researching that because I wanted to challenge some ideas that come the Industrial Revolution, disabled people weren't able to work, all went to the workhouse, and that was it for disabled people in the workplace. And I wondered if that was right, really. And there was a couple of things I was thinking about, and of course it isn't. Of course, there were loads of disabled people working in textile mills. Yes, a lot of people became disabled.
That's what I was going to say. Was that something that changed people's attitudes at all? Do you know about this? I imagine suddenly if you've got a buildings where everyone's working in that community and it's so dangerous and people are regularly becoming deaf and going through life-altering injury, you'd think that might challenge, unfortunately for the wrong reasons, that might then challenge people's perceptions of what a disabled person is capable of at that time.
I mean, I don't know, because it's different times, isn't it? It's a long time ago and we can't sort of, plonk our thinking on top of what might have been going on for people then. And I think life was hard for a lot of working class people. Well, for all working class people, life was very hard if we're going back to the 18th and 19th centuries. And maybe to an extent, this was like, this is what happens at work. This is what we've got to live with. Yeah. And this is even harder, yes, but this is how it is. And certainly into the 20th century, talking about hearing loss, that I think a lot of mill workers, again, just took that for granted. This is, loads of us are deaf now. But made something of that in terms of lip reading, for example. So, and that being a bit of a badge of honour for people who worked in the mills, that they, it showed how tough, how resilient they were, and it showed how they, could get one over on the managers and overseers who couldn't lip read and who could pass messages, that sort of thing. So there's all that history. There's a lot of history going on there. So thinking, about the mass of people who maybe became disabled through industrial injury, basically. Then another strand of people, and James is one of those, James Scott, who the zine's about. Then, I was also thinking, well, these were noisy places in the mills, but, that wouldn't have been a disadvantage for people who were deaf, for people who, were already deaf and thinking about going to work. And James Scott is one of the ex-pupils of, I'm going to use the term that it was called at the time, the Yorkshire Institution for the Deaf and Dumb, which was a big school for deaf children in Doncaster, which still exists, actually, that school. And James was one of the pupils there. That school in the 1840s and then later in the 1850s did a survey of their ex-pupils to try and find out whether they were churning out, useful members of society, whether the education that people had been, meant that they were going off and doing jobs and whatever. So they did a survey of employers and family members and other people to find out what people were working at, what they were doing now. And of course that showed that people were working in all sorts of industries, but it being Yorkshire, of course, many of them were working in textiles. And, this was interesting to me with trying to find out, were the disabled people who worked in the industry. So, James was one of those. And I think is an interesting story. Again, I won't give it all away. James is an interesting story because he, you know, clearly wasn't dependent. He didn't fit this stereotype that, you know, maybe really took hold in Victorian times that, you know, poor, tragic, disabled people, we've got to look after them, or we've got to pity them, or we've got to be frightened of them, or whatever, you know, all these thinking that disabled people had about, that Victorians had about disabled people. James went to work, looked after his mother for years and years, stayed working in Horbury near Wakefield. He's just, as I say, as it says on the cover there that you read out, he's just one example of a number of deaf and disabled people who did that, who were living useful lives, who were just getting on with things. So I thought that was another interesting strand of it. And there's lots more stories to tell, and hopefully, I'm going to do another zine that tells a few more of those stories. That also links into my current project, which is an exhibition that's just opened at Leeds Industrial Museum. And that exhibition is called Any Work That Wanted Doing. It's called Any Work That Wanted Doing because that's sort of taken from the evidence that was given to the Factories Inquiry Commission of 1833 by a disabled Leeds man called John Dawson. And John had been one of the many people who'd worked since childhood in a mill and become disabled as a result. But he gave evidence to that inquiry, to that commission, as did many other disabled people. And I think that's really important to remember, because by giving evidence, often in the face of opposition from their managers, from the mill owners, by giving that evidence, their voices were a really, really important part of the movement for factory reform.
Right.
Yeah, so I think that links back to something you said ages ago, you know, about how people maybe viewed themselves. And I think, you know, obviously people viewed disability very differently in those days. But yes, I just think that's, you know, those people were active. They you know, spoke up and they played their part in that, and a really important part. Yeah, so in Any Work That Wanted Doing, so there's eight new artworks that have been made by disabled artists in West Yorkshire, any of them from Leeds. And some of those pieces do bring in contemporary issues, and I'm particularly thinking of a very, very detailed piece by Becky Moore working with Becky Cherryman. Becky Moore being a textile artist and Becky Cherryman being a poet. So this is like a very large wall hanging, which almost one half of it is a poem that's been created. The other half is patchwork. We were just talking about patchwork. A patchwork quilt that covers it and goes to the bottom. And within those patches, there are archival photos and there's quotes from people like John Dawson, who I was mentioning, from the past. But there's also contemporary quotes in there about disability at work from people's own experiences. So that's a really, really interesting piece. There's a lot in it, and you can see that at Leeds Industrial Museum along with the other work. And that exhibition, Any Work That Wanted Doing, is on till January next year, so there's plenty of time to get over to see it.
That's our next weekend plan sorted then. Thank you very much. It just made me think that when we were in quite a jolly mood, going like on a romp to Manchester, and I'd not been to I'm going to say it wrong again, the People's History Museum, and then we went into the exhibition, and it really took the wind out of our sails when suddenly you're reminded that you're dealing with here not just you know, to the barricades kind of justice movement, be like, oh no, people have been dying, and this is to prevent, this is artwork that's about people unnecessarily dying.
It's just so unromantic, and I think sometimes we can get swept up in a bit of romantic to the barrarcades.
I don't think you have to, because you've got to keep going, haven't you? You've got to have a laugh in your life.
Yeah.
But it was the artwork in that exhibition was incredibly moving and really poignant, and then particularly that what was it
Vince
that you
Laws? Vince Laws is series of shrouds, he calls them, rather than banners. You know, shrouds called, the series is called DWP, Deaths Make Me Sick. Yes, which
So
of course they do. They should do, because that's a series of stenciled sheets, basically, that are commemorating the lives but marking the deaths of a number of people who died, particularly after being adjudged to be fit for work by the DWP, when they clearly were not. And having the benefits cut, and often having that benefit cut is the direct cause then of people taking their own lives. And that anger in that artwork really comes across in a way that, as you were saying before, takes the disability art in an occupational, cosy setting that sort of infantilized and pastoralized, takes it well and truly out of that setting, says this is dark, this is punk, this is anger. Yes. Which originally, disability art, I think, means all sorts of things to all people. Originally, disability art was like the creative wing of the disabled people's movement and was political. That's what it was. And, and people defined it as art made by disabled people that reflected that experience of being a disabled person. And a lot of it was overtly political. And, there's been a shift, and I think there's some good in that, that definition for many people has broadened, and it means, and some people would say any art that's made by a disabled person in some way reflects their experience, and so therefore is disability art. What I wouldn't call disability art is that occupational therapy that's led by non-disabled people, that's given to disabled people often make something of that for themselves. But yes, it's a whole different thing,
Yeah. As you were talking then, I had about 3 different thoughts, and I've struggled to keep hold of not one of them. No, that's all right. That's done. Oh, yeah, that was it. You mentioned about, was it in Wakefield, that people walking past the shrouds?
Oh, right. Yes. Yes, because they're very immediate, aren't they? And they're very accessible, and they're very, clearly people can see what those are and connect with them. So yes, I was, really pleased to be able to show those in an exhibition. A few years ago, it was called Piss on Pity. It was about disabled people's ambivalent relationship to charity, I suppose. Piss on Pity, we had some of Vince's shrouds up there, so they were, very prominent in it, and the exhibition was in an empty shop unit in Wakefield. So many people, would pass by, do a bit of a double take, come in, what's this, and so many people had their own stories of dealing with the DWP, of the difficulties of trying to get the benefits that they needed to support them and give them dignity and just ability to live their lives,
And it's exactly so that. We were talking about it today about the NHS and the state the NHS is in at the moment, and I think it's similar, where they are such issues that are often dealt with like behind closed doors, that are in families that are already struggling, that people are feeling isolated, and then as soon as you have someone, an artist, which is what artists are best at, speak out, then suddenly everyone goes, oh, that was my experience, that was my neighbour's experience, that was my auntie's experience, and it opens those floodgates for going, hang on, we're all experiencing this up and down the country. And I think it's going to happen with the NHS, where I've had my second death in the family that we feel was a preventable death today, that's been because of lack of care, and just because the hospitals are not functioning as hospitals.
Because they're not funded.
They're not funded
properly,
so people are dying and have been dying in our hospitals and in our so-called social care system. And it's another one that when it's grief and it's personal, you don't want, it's not your instinct to then turn that into something political necessarily. Maybe it's not your story, or maybe you're being careful of family and friends and things like that. But it's got to happen sooner or later. These tidal waves, like
Yes,
how bad
yes.
does it need to get
Yes.
for people to go, enough is enough?
Yeah.
I mean, having said that, I'm sure I certainly feel like I've been saying that for decades. I'm
Yeah,
sure
yeah.
you feel like you've been saying it for decades and decades.
Well,
like how bad
Yeah.
does it need to get for everyone to just say
Yeah.
enough is enough?
Yes. You wonder, don't you?
Yeah.
But you're right. I mean, that's the power of art, isn't it? To bring
Yeah.
some of that to attention and to, speak for people. Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
open the floodgates and make the private public.
Yeah.